All right, welcome to another deep dive with us. This time, we're taking on a topic that I think, it's been around for a while, obviously. We're talking about race,
Yeah, a topic that's certainly been on people's minds for centuries.
and it's a big one.
Yeah, and it's one of those things that everyone kind of has a basic idea of. But when you really start to dig into it from a philosophical perspective especially, it gets a lot more complex. So I think for this deep dive, I mean, what we're really trying to do is kind of map out how a philosopher might approach the whole concept of race, all the different angles and debates.
Absolutely. And the good news is we actually have a ton of contemporary philosophical work to draw on. So it's not like we're starting from scratch here.
Right, exactly. I mean, just looking at what we have here, there's so much to unpack. Yeah, and I think right off the bat, one thing you realize when you start reading this stuff is that there is no simple definition of race. I mean, some philosophers are even questioning whether it exists at all. And then, of course, you have others who are exploring all the different dimensions of it, the social, the political. Some even get into the biological stuff, although that's definitely a very, very tricky area.
Right. Well, I mean, that's sort of the perfect place to start, isn't it?
Yeah.
Going way back to the beginning, like how did this concept even come about? Where did this idea of race
Yeah.
come from? Is it something that's always been with us, throughout history? Or is it a more recent thing?
Right, that's the fundamental question. And there's actually, there's a real debate about it among scholars. The prevailing view is that it's a modern concept, like the
Yeah.
way we think about race today. But there are some who argue that, there were certain ways of thinking about group differences, even in pre-modern times, that kind of foreshadowed later racial thought.
Interesting. So, like, what kind of pre-modern examples are we talking about? Because, I mean, I know Geraldine Heng talks about a medieval concept of race, particularly when it comes to English Jews in the 13th century.
Right, Hing Hing, she's got this really interesting, I guess you could call it a working hypothesis. She suggests that race, even back then, functioned as a primary way to differentiate groups, right?
Hmm.
And it did this by selectively essentializing certain differences.
Selectively essentializing, huh?
Yeah, what she means is certain traits were basically presented as like absolute, like fundamental differences. And the point of this, she argues, was to create these social hierarchies, to, distribute power unequally between different groups. But here's the thing, her definition doesn't actually rely on biology at all. So the key takeaway here, I think, is that race can be this tool for creating social hierarchies based on differences that seem really fundamental, even if they're not actually based in biology.
Okay, so in the case of the English Jews in the 13th century, what were those kind of essentialized traits that, made them different in this pre-modern racial way?
Well, in this case, Hang argues that religion was the main thing. Being Jewish was constructed as this fundamentally different and subordinate identity, and that's how they justified treating them differently, discriminating against them. It wasn't about biology, not in the way we think about it today, at least.
Right, right. Okay, so religion, not biology. That's a really important point. Now, Adam Hochman, he also argues that race isn't purely modern, right? But I think he has a different take on when this concept emerged.
Yeah, Hockman, he disagrees with Heng's interpretation of that 13th century English example. He says, no, a real concept of race, it came later, more towards the late medieval period, around the 15th century. He points to these Spanish statutes of blood purity, the limpieza de sangre.
Okay, the limpieza de sangre. So what made this concept different from, what Hang was talking about?
Well, for Hockman, it's all about perceived biological ancestry, These statutes were used to categorize Jewish converts to Christianity, the conversos, as racially distinct. And here's the key difference from Heng's example. Converting to Christianity didn't actually change their racial status. It was seen as something inherent, unchangeable, like it was in their blood. So you see this shift towards a concept of race that's really grounded in biology, or at least the perception of biological lineage.
So to be clear, in Hang's view, you could potentially change your race by converting, right? But in Hochman's later example, that's not possible because it's tied to something supposedly biological and fixed.
Exactly. That's a really crucial shift in how they understood the concept. And then Hockman goes on to say that the modern concept of race, the one we're more familiar with, it added two more elements that weren't there in the Spanish version.
Okay, two more elements. What were those?
First, the idea that all human populations, everyone, belongs to at least one race. The Spanish concept was more limited, really focused on, converted Jews and Muslims. It wasn't meant to be a way of categorizing everyone.
Right, makes sense. Okay, so that's the first edition. What about the second?
The second is this. The modern concept places race within a biological hierarchy. It puts it below the species level, like a subspecies. Pre-modern theories, they didn't necessarily think of race in this hierarchical biological way.
Okay, so it became universal, applied to everyone, and it was placed within this biological hierarchy. So we've got essentialized traits, often religious, then perceived biological lineage, and now this universal subspecies categorization. It's fascinating how this concept keeps evolving. And then, of course, we get to the more explicitly biological conceptions of race. François Bernier, right, in the 17th century.
Yeah, Bernier. His work is definitely a step towards these biological classifications. He proposed dividing humanity into 4 or 5, what he called species or races of men. And his categories were based on physical stuff, things he observed during his travels, like skin color, eye shape, hair texture, even bone structure. So you start seeing this real attempt to systematically categorize humans based on what you could actually see, the physical traits.
So now physical appearance becomes central to how they're defining race. And I mean, that brings us to one of the biggest debates in the history of race theory. Monogenesis versus polygenesis.
Yeah.
Can you break that down for us?
Sure. So monogenesis, it's basically the idea that all human beings, we all came from a single common ancestor, kind of like the biblical story of creation. But then you have polygenesis. This argues that the different races, they actually had separate origins. Some even thought they might be different species.
So one origin versus multiple origins. And big names like Hume and Kant weighed in on this, right?
Yeah, they did. Hume's position is a bit controversial. In one of his essays, he included a footnote suggesting that Black people and other species of men were naturally inferior. Scholars still debate whether that meant he was a pelagianist, whether he believed in separate origins. Some say it seems like he did, but he didn't really provide any, concrete evidence for it.
Right, okay. And Kant, I know he's like a major figure in philosophy. What was his take?
Kant, he was a strong advocate for monogenesis. He believed in this common lineal root genus for all humans, which he placed somewhere in Europe. He said all the different races, they developed from the shared ancestry, but the environment played a big role in shaping the physical differences we see. Things like climate. He even used the fact that different races could, interbreed and have fertile offspring as evidence that they were all part of the same species, the mixing of traits, that kind of thing. So for Kant, it was all about reconciling these obvious physical differences with the idea that we all came from the same source.
So he's saying we're all one species, but the environment created the variations. Interesting. And I know there's a lot of back and forth among scholars about Kant's views on race, right?
Yeah.
Some criticize him pretty harshly, while others give him a bit more, I guess you could say, leeway.
Definitely. Yeah, there are some who say that his ideas, even though he was a monogynist, kind of paved the way for racist ideologies that came later. Others, they argue that, look, Kant's views, they actually evolved over time. They point to his later writings where he was against colonialism and slavery. They say, see, he was becoming more egalitarian. But then, you have others who push back on that, saying, well, maybe those later statements were more about political strategy than a genuine change of heart. So it's a really tough one. It's hard to judge historical figures, based on our current understanding of things.
Absolutely. Okay, let's move on to another key figure, Johann Friedrich Blumenbach. He's often considered one of the founders of anthropology, right?
Yeah.
What did he bring to the table in terms of race?
Yeah, Blumenbach, he's another big name. He also believed in monogenesis, that single origin for all humans. But he's the one who introduced this 5 varieties classification system based mainly on skull shape. He thought that was a more scientific way to categorize people than just using skin color. And of course, he's famous for coining the term Caucasian, which he associated with, well, basically with the idea of superior beauty. He thought people from the Caucasus Mountains, especially the Georgians, were the most beautiful. And then you have his other categories like Mongolian, Ethiopian, American, and Malay.
Right. So even though he believed in a common ancestor, he was still categorizing people and, it seems, creating a bit of a hierarchy.
Yeah, it's true. Even though he was firmly against polygenesis, his system, and especially that term Caucasian, it did kind of feed into this idea of racial hierarchy, which, not great, obviously, even if that wasn't what he intended. But it's important to remember he was completely against the idea of humans and apes interbreeding. He really emphasized that we are one species. And he proposed this internal biological force, the nisus formativus, that he said was influenced by the environment. And that's what created these racial variations within the human species.
Right, okay. So it's complicated. But overall, it seems like monogenesis was gaining ground, scientifically speaking, right? But then, in the mid-19th century, you have this resurgence of polygenist ideas with the so-called American School of Anthropology.
Yeah, the American school, they were really pushing those Pelagianist ideas, especially in the U.S. You had guys like Louis Agassiz, Josiah Nott, and George Glidden. Agassiz, actually, he started out as a monogynist, but he said his observations in America, particularly of African Americans, made him change his mind. He thought, no way, they couldn't possibly share the same ancestry as Europeans. And of course, this school, they were very much tied to the whole idea of racial hierarchy. They used their theories to justify slavery, arguing that these different races were just fundamentally different, created separately, and some were just naturally superior to others.
And Arthur de Gobineau, his ideas also had an influence, didn't they? The whole Aryan race concept.
Yeah. Oh, definitely. Gobineau, he was a French writer, and his book, Essay on the Inequality of the Human Races, was really influential, especially for the American school. Not even translated parts of it, and used them to support his own arguments, cherry-picking the stuff that fit his agenda. So yeah, Gobineau, his ideas provided this kind of like intellectual veneer for this whole movement that was really about justifying white supremacy and racial segregation.
Right, using science or philosophy, or at least the appearance of it, to support existing prejudices. That's kind of a recurring theme, isn't it?
Hmm.
Now, I know Darwin's theory of evolution, that had a huge impact on all of this, right? How did that shake things up?
Darwin, yeah, he was a game changer. His theory basically provided the scientific backing for monogenesis. In his book, The Descent of Man, he even predicted that the whole monogenesis-polygenesis debate would eventually just die out because the evidence was so clearly on the side of monogenesis. He pointed to things like, the fact that people of different races could have children together and those children could have children and so on. He also talked about how different races shared the same mental capacities. So for him, it was clear, we're all one species. Now, he didn't think natural selection alone could explain all the racial differences we see. He thought sexual selection, how people choose their mates based on certain traits, might have played a role too.
So evolution really solidified the idea of a single human origin. But, I mean, even if we accept that, the question remains, how did these racial differences arise? And this is where eugenics comes in, right?
Yeah, eugenics. Francis Galton, he's the one who coined that term. He was all about improving the human species through selective breeding. He had these two ideas: positive eugenics and negative eugenics. Positive eugenics was about encouraging, the best people to have more children. Negative eugenics was about discouraging or even preventing people deemed unfit from reproducing. And, well, the positive eugenics thing, it never really took off in terms of policy. But negative eugenics, that was a different story. It got implemented in various ways in the U.S. There was even the Supreme Court case, Buck v. Bell, that basically allowed states to forcibly sterilize people they considered genetically undesirable.
Wow. So you see how these ideas, these biological theories about race, could actually lead to some pretty horrific practices.
Yeah, it's really disturbing. And those ideas about biological determinism and race, they reached this kind of peak, I think, with guys like Houston Stewart Chamberlain and Madison Grant in the early 20th century.
Chamberlain and Grant. Remind me what they're known for.
Well, Chamberlain wrote this book, The Foundations of the 19th Century, and Grant wrote The Passing of the Great Race. Both of these books were basically, the ultimate expression of biological race thinking. And they were very much in line with the racial prejudices of the time. They were used to justify all sorts of discriminatory policies. Chamberlain, for example, he went so far as to say that Western civilization was created by the Aryan race, and even that Jesus was an Aryan. I mean, talk about twisting history to fit your agenda. And Grant, here in the U.S., he was a big advocate for racial segregation and banning interracial marriage. His ideas even influenced immigration laws and those anti-miscegenation laws that were in place until the Supreme Court finally struck them down in 1967.
Right. So you have this whole period where this biological concept of race is just completely entrenched.
Yeah.
But thankfully, things started to change. I know anthropology and genetics especially played a big role in challenging these ideas, right?
Oh, absolutely. Even while those guys were gaining popularity, academics were starting to push back. Franz Boas, for instance, he was a really important anthropologist who did a lot of research that challenged the idea that racial categories are fixed and unchangeable. He studied, for example, the skull measurements of immigrants in the U.S., and he found that they actually changed over time, suggesting that the environment, things like nutrition, had an impact on these supposedly fixed traits. So he basically showed that physical differences and even differences in mental abilities that were often attributed to race weren't just about biology.
Right. So environment matters, maybe even more than they thought. And Ashley Montagu, he took it a step further, didn't he? Using genetics to really debunk the biological basis of race.
Yeah, Montague, he was a big critic of the whole biological concept of race. He said that, when you look at it from the perspective of modern genetics, this traditional way of thinking about race based on those easily observable traits, it just falls apart. Genes, they don't line up neatly with those broad racial classifications. Two people can look very similar, even though their genes are actually quite different. And his work, it was really influential. He contributed to the UNESCO statements on race in the mid-20th century, which basically said officially that the biological concept of race has no scientific validity. And later, the American Association of Physical Anthropologists, they came out and said the same thing. So by the mid to late 20th century, the scientific consensus was pretty clear. Biological race, it's just not a real thing.
So science basically says, no, race is not a biological category. But obviously the concept hasn't disappeared. It's still a huge part of our social and political lives. So that brings us to the more contemporary philosophical debates, right? Like, what does it even mean to talk about race if it's not biological?
Right. There's so much to say here. Ron Mellon, he has this really useful framework for understanding these debates. He says, first of all, let's put aside racial naturalism. That's the old biological view we were just talking about. It's outdated. So what's left? Well, he divides the current landscape into two main camps: metaphysical and normative. The metaphysical camp is all about, what is race, really? Does it exist? What does it mean? Within that camp, you have racial skepticism, racial constructivism, and racial population naturalism. And then you have the normative camp, which is about, well, what should we do about race? Should we get rid of the concept? Should we keep it? And there you have things like eliminativism and conservationism.
Okay, so lots of different angles to consider. Let's start with racial skepticism. Who are the main players there, and what do they argue?
The skeptics, people like Anthony Appiah and Naomi Zak, they basically say, look, because the biological understanding of race has been debunked, race doesn't really exist. They argue that the whole idea of race is based on this notion of essential biological categories, and we know that's just wrong. Zak, for example, she goes through all these different potential biological bases for race, essences, geographic origins, physical traits, genetics, ancestry. She picks them apart one by one, and her conclusion is none of them hold up. They don't actually support the concept of race. So the main takeaway from the skeptics is this: if race isn't biological, then it's not real.
And that skepticism often leads to this idea of racial eliminativism, right?
Yeah.
Like we should just get rid of the whole concept of race.
Yeah, that's where a lot of the early skeptics landed. Appiah and Zak, for example, they were both eliminativists. They said, look, the concept is based on a lie, it's harmful, it's led to so much discrimination and injustice, so let's just ditch it altogether. But later on, Appiah actually developed a more nuanced view, what he calls racial nominalism.
Okay, racial nominalism. How's that different from just, eliminating race altogether?
So in his later work, Appiah acknowledges that human folk races, as he calls them, they're real. They actually function as social identities. But he says the problem is that they operate as if they have a biological basis. Like there's this underlying belief that these racial groups are biologically distinct, even though that's not true. So Appiah shifts his focus to how we actually use racial labels. He talks about ascription, how others categorize us, identification, how we see ourselves, and treatment, how we're treated by others based on race. And he argues that all of these social uses of race, they have real consequences, even if there's no actual biological basis for it.
So you're saying, yeah, races aren't biologically real, but racial identities are. That's a pretty important distinction. And then, yeah, this debate between eliminatism and conservationism, right? What's that all about?
So Daniel Wodak, he points out that the whole debate about race shouldn't just be about whether it refers to something real, biologically or socially. He says we should also think about how we actually use the word race. What does it do for us? And this is where the conservationists come in. They argue that even though there's no biological basis for race, racial terms, they still serve a purpose, especially when it comes to fighting racial inequality. We need to be able to talk about race if we want to address racism. And Wodak says, look, it's not just a simple choice between eliminating race and keeping it. It's more of a spectrum, right? We have to think about how much we want to rely on these categories, how we use them in our language and in our social practices.
Okay, so it's not black and white, so to speak. Now, on the other side of racial skepticism, we have racial constructivism. What's the main idea there?
So the constructivists, they agree with the skeptics that the biological concept of race is wrong. But they argue that races, they do exist, but as social categories. They say that races are created through social, cultural, historical processes, not biology. So they're real in that they have real consequences, how societies categorize people based on race. It affects their lives, their opportunities, their well-being. And normatively, a lot of constructivists are also conservationists. They say we need to keep the concept of race so we can fight these socially constructed racial inequalities.
So they're saying race is a social creation, not a biological one, but it have very real effects. And I know there are different types of constructivism, right? Like thin, interactive kind and institutional. Can you explain those?
Sure. So thin constructivism, guys like Charles Mills, Lucius Outlaw, Bernard Boxill, they basically see race as, a grouping based on shared ancestry and these surface level traits like skin color, which they say aren't actually that significant genetically. They acknowledge that a lot of people think race is biological, but they reject that idea themselves.
Okay, so thin constructivism, it's about those visible markers and the folk theory of race, which they're rejecting. What about interactive kind?
Interactive kind constructivism, thinkers like Adrian Piper, Charles Mills, actually in some of his work they go further. They say, look, when someone is categorized as a particular race, it leads to shared experiences. Like if you're treated differently, if you face discrimination just because of your race, that shared experience actually helps to create a sense of racial identity, a sense of belonging to a particular racial group.
Right, so the experience of being treated a certain way because of your race, it actually contributes to the reality of race as a social category.
Exactly. And then you have institutional constructivism. Sally Haslinger, Paul Taylor, Jorge Garcia, they fall into this camp. They emphasize that race isn't just about individual perceptions or interactions. It's woven into the very fabric of society. Our laws, our political systems, our economy, our culture, they all operate in ways that recognize and reinforce racial categories. And Taylor, for example, he argues that, look, race is a real thing in the U.S. precisely because our institutions treat it as real.
Right, it's built into the system. So thin constructivism focuses on those surface level things. Interactive kind looks at how shared experiences create a sense of racial identity.
Yeah.
And then institutional constructivism is all about how race is embedded in the structures of society. And I know Sally Haslinger, she has her own version of constructivism, which isn't necessarily conservationist, right?
Yeah.
What's different about her view?
Right. Haslinger, she defines races as racialized groups. And for her, they're defined by this combo of factors, like perceived physical features, ancestry, social position, like whether those features and ancestry are linked to subordinate or privileged positions in society, and how all of that contributes to these systems of subordination and privilege. Now, she acknowledges that racial identities are real and important right now, especially in the fight for justice. But she's kind of hesitant about fully embracing those categories in the long run because for her, it's all about power. Race is about how power is distributed in society. And her thinking is that in a truly just society, these racial categories, they might not be as relevant anymore. So she recognizes the social construction of race, but she's also critical of it in a way.
Okay, interesting. And there's also this distinction between political constructivism and cultural constructivism.
Yeah. Yeah, Chaik Jeffers, he talks about this. He points out that different constructivists focus on different things. Political constructivism, people like Haslinger, they see power and inequality as the defining features of race. It's all about how race has been used as a tool for domination. But cultural constructivism, which Jeffers himself supports, it puts more emphasis on cultural differences, cultural identities. They say that race isn't just about racism, the negative stuff. It's also about shared cultural traditions, practices, even forms of joy within racialized groups. So for them, race has a positive side too.
So one is focused on power, the other on culture. Now, I know there are also some views that try to find a middle ground, something between biological race and social constructivism. What are those?
Yeah, there are some really interesting alternatives out there. You have McPherson with his deflationary pluralism. He basically wants to replace the word race with socio-ancestry. The idea is to acknowledge ancestry and how it relates to people's appearance, but without all the baggage that comes with the word race.
Okay, so a kind of semantic shift. What else?
Then there's Glasgow with his basic racial realism. He says, look, the way most people think about race, it's just about these big groups with visible biological differences. It's not about some deep biological essence, but it's also not really socially constructed in the way that constructivists say. It's just like a basic observation about how people look.
So not biological, not social, just basic.
Right. And then you have Hardiman. He has this idea of deflationary realism. He thinks we actually use 4 different concepts of race: racialist, minimalist, populationist, and social race. The racialist one is that morally loaded idea of different human kinds. Minimalist is just about ancestry and the physical traits that go with it, but in a neutral way, without any value judgments. Populationist is about biological populations. And then social race is kind of like social constructivism. And he thinks we need all four of these concepts to really make sense of how we think and talk about race. His minimalist concept, the one about ancestry and traits, he uses that to critique the cultural constructivists because he says, look, culture isn't really essential to this basic understanding of race. And then he has the separate minimalist conception of ethnicity to capture the cultural stuff.
Okay, so he's trying to create this more nuanced vocabulary for talking about race and ethnicity. Pretty ambitious.
Definitely. And then there's racial population naturalism. This one tries to find biologically meaningful groupings of humans without resorting to those old essentialist ideas about race. They often use the concept of species as an analogy, pointing out that even species aren't always perfectly distinct, there's variation and overlap. So they say, maybe it's the same with race.
Okay, so how do they go about defining these biologically meaningful groupings?
Well, there are a few different approaches. One is cladistic race. This is all about ancestry, like those family trees that biologists use. Another is socially isolated race, which focuses on groups that haven't intermarried much, so they've become genetically distinct. And then there's genetically clustered race, which uses statistical analysis to identify clusters of genes that are associated with certain geographic regions and physical traits. So they're basically trying to find patterns in the genetic data that roughly align with how people think about race. But the problem is, these biologically informed concepts, they often don't match up very well with our common sense understanding of race.
Can you give me an example?
Sure. Like with cladistic race, people from Northeast Asia might be grouped more closely with Europeans than with people from Southeast Asia, which is kind of counterintuitive, right? And with genetically clustered race, scientists have to decide where to draw the lines between these clusters, and those decisions can be pretty arbitrary. So while some argue that these biologically based concepts might be useful for certain kinds of research, like in medicine, others worry that they could actually reinforce those old, harmful ideas about biological race and lead to more discrimination.
Yeah, it's a slippery slope, for sure. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. Let's switch gears a bit and talk about race and ethnicity. Are those just two different words for the same thing?
Not at all. People use them interchangeably sometimes, but there are some really important distinctions. Cornell and Hartman, they give this really clear definition. Race, they say, is about perceived physical differences that are considered socially significant. So it's not about actual biology, it's about how people interpret those physical differences and give them meaning. Ethnicity, on the other hand, is about shared culture. Things like language, religion, history, customs, ancestry.
Okay, so race is more about physical appearance and ethnicity is more about culture. What other distinctions do they make?
They highlight a few key things. First, race is usually imposed on people by others. It's ascribed. Ethnicity is more about self-identification. Second, race is very much tied to the history of globalization, colonialism, those power dynamics. Third, race is almost always about hierarchy, ranking different groups. Fourth, it's seen as something inherent and unchangeable, like you're born with it. And finally, the physical differences between racial groups are often exaggerated and given way more importance than they deserve. Ethnicity, it's different. People often have more choice in how they identify. The physical differences are usually less important, and it's more about shared cultural practices and beliefs.
And that idea of choice, that seems like a really big difference. People have more freedom to choose how they identify ethnically than racially, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. Like, think about white Americans. They often have this ethnic option, as Mary Waters calls it. They can choose to emphasize their Irish heritage or their Italian heritage or whatever, depending on the situation. But for people of color, it's often not that simple. They don't always get to choose how they're perceived or how society categorizes them.
Their race is often imposed on them regardless of how they see themselves. And there's that whole thing about panethnicity too, right? Where different ethnic groups get lumped together under one racial category, like Asian American or Hispanic or Latino.
Yeah, panethnicity. That's where things get really interesting. It's like, how do these categories even form? Genlis Spiritu, she talks about how, groups like Chinese Americans, Japanese Americans, Filipino Americans, they get grouped together as Asian American. Sometimes it's because the dominant society just lumps them all together, and sometimes it's because those groups themselves see it as a way to gain political power, by uniting under a common banner.
And Hispanic or Latino, that's a whole other can of worms, isn't it?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, technically, it's not a racial category in the U.S. Census, but it often functions like one. People make assumptions, they stereotype, and Latinos often face discrimination based on that label, even if it's not officially about race. And there's actually a big philosophical debate about it. Some say it's just an ethnic identity, based on shared language and culture. Others say it's racialized, it operates like race in society. And then there are those who say, well, maybe it's something totally different, neither race nor ethnicity, but its own unique thing.
So a lot of gray areas there. Okay, so race and ethnicity, they're related, but they're not the same, and both are heavily influenced by all these social, historical, political forces.
Yeah.
Now, let's talk about how philosophers think about race in terms of morality, politics, and law. Our sources mention three main areas of focus. Let's start with racial justice. How do philosophers approach that?
This is a big one, and there are so many different views. Lawrence Blum, for instance, he makes this distinction between racism, which he says is about believing that one race is inferior, and racialized group, which is about having an identity that comes with socially imposed disadvantages. He's not really sure about using race-specific policies too.